Hello everyone, I am Halo Salvation 567, and I'm going to be trying my hand at some book narration today. Today I will be attempting my read from Christopher Paolini's, and I hope I pronounced that correctly, book MURTAGH. I've been a very huge fan of this writer for quite some time, and I'm looking forward to this. I understand, the internet is an unforgiving place, and I welcome the constructive criticism. So we will be beginning in part 1 of the book called Union. There's quite a few parts, but we're only just doing chapter 1. If I can flip to it fast enough. Oh. Almost forgot the most important part. Excuse me. Chapter 1. Maventide. Will you go alone? MURTAGH gave Thorn a quizzical look. The red dragon sat crouched next to him atop the rocky hill, where they had landed. In the fading dusk, the sparkle of the dragon scales was subdued, tamped down like coals in a banked fire, waiting for a breath of wind to flare back to brilliance. What, you'd go with me? A wolfish grin split Thorn's jaws, showing rows of sharp white teeth, each as long as a dagger. Why not? They already fear us. Let them scream and scurry at our arrival. The dragon's thoughts resonated like a bell in MURTAGH's mind. He shook his head as he unbuckled his sword Zarok from his waist. You'd like that, wouldn't you? Thorn's jaws hung open wider, and his bird tongue ran across his chops. Maybe. MURTAGH could just picture Thorn stalking down a narrow street, scraping the sides of the building with his armored shoulders, breaking beams and shutters and cornices, while folks fled before him. MURTAGH knew how that would end, with fire and blood and a flattened circle of destruction. I think you'd best wait here. Thorn shuffled his velvet wings and coughed deep in his throat, his way of laughing. Then perhaps you should use magic to change the color of my scales, and we could pretend to be Aragon and Saphira. Wouldn't that be fine sport? MURTAGH snorted as he laid Zarok across a patch of dry grass. He'd been surprised to discover that Thorn had a trenchant sense of humor. It hadn't been readily apparent when they had been bonded, partly because of Thorn's youth, and partly because of attending circumstances. For a moment, MURTAGH's mood darkened. No? Well then, if you change your mind, you'll be the first to know. With the tip of his snout, Thorn nudged the sword. I wish you would take your fang, your claw, your sharpened affliction. MURTAGH knew Thorn was nervous. He always was when MURTAGH left. Even for a short while. Don't worry, I'll be fine. A puff of pale smoke rose from the dragon's flared nostrils. I don't trust that shark-mouthed sculler. I don't trust anyone except for you and her. MURTAGH faltered as he went to one of the saddlebags that hung along Thorn's side. An image of Nasuda's almond eyes flashed before him. Cheekbones, teeth, parts and pieces that failed to sum the whole. A memory of her scent, accompanied by a yearning and a sorrow, an aching absence for what might have been and now was lost. Yes, he couldn't have lied to Thorn, even if he wanted to. They were too closely joined for that. The dragon was kind enough to return the conversation to safer ground. Do you think Saros has scented anything of interest? It would be better if he hasn't. MURTAGH excavated a ball of brown twine from the saddlebag. But if he has, do we fly toward the storm or away? A thin smile stretched MURTAGH's lips. That depends on how violent the storm. It may be obvious. It might not. The wind can lie. He measured a length of twine. Then we'll continue sniffing about until it becomes obvious. As long as we can still change course if need be. One hopes. Thorn's near eye, a deep-set ruby that gleamed with a fierce inner light, remained fixed on MURTAGH as he cut twine and used it to tie Zarok's crossguard to belt and scabbard so the crimson sword wouldn't slide free. Then he placed Zarok in the saddlebag, where it would be safe and hidden, and he returned to stand before Thorn. "I'll be back before dawn." The dragon hunkered low on his haunches, as if braced to take a blow. He kneaded the ground with his curved claws, like a great cat kneading a blanket, and small rocks popped and cracked with explosive force between his talons. A low hum, almost a whine, came from his chest. MURTAGH laid a hand on Thor's jagged forehead, and strove to impress a sense of calm and confidence on him. Dark chords of a distress echoed in the depths of Thorn's mindscape. "I'll be fine. If you need me, you'll be there, I know."
Excuse me.
Thorn bent his neck, and his claws grew still. From his mind, MURTAGH felt a hard, if brittle, resolve. They understood each other. Be careful. Watch for any who might try and sneak up on you. Another bone-vibrating hum emanated from the center of Thorn's chest. Then MURTAGH pulled the hood of his cloak over his head and started down the side of the hill, picking a path between jags of solitary stone and clusters of prickly hordebrush. He looked back once to see Thorn still crouched atop the crest of the hill, watching with slitted eyes. A brief pause in the chapter. A man with a dragon was never truly alone, so thought MURTAGH as he headed west with a long, loose-limbed stride. No matter how many leagues separated him and Thorn, a part of them would always remain connected, even if the distance kept them from hearing each other's thoughts or feeling each other's emotions. Magic of the oldest kind joined them, and never would they be quit of it until one of them had died. Yet magic was not their only bond. The experiences he and Thorn had shared, the hardships, the mental attacks, the torture, had been so intense, so singular in nature. MURTAGH didn't think anyone else could truly understand what they had endured. There was a certain comfort in the knowledge, wherever he went and whatever he did, Thorn would always be there for him. What's more, Thorn would understand, on occasion disapprove, perhaps, but then, even then, with empathy and compassion. And the same was true in reverse. There was also a sense of confinement to the knowledge. Never could they escape one another. Not really. But MURTAGH didn't mind. He was well sick of being alone. The land sloped away beneath him until after several miles it arrived at the Bay of Fundor. There, at the water's edge, lay the city of Sinyon, a rough-walled collection of buildings, dark with shadows, save for the occasional lamp or candle, warm gems set against the encroaching night. Rows of fishing boats with furled sails floated alongside the stone wharves, and with them 3 deep-sea vessels with tall masts and broad hulls, ships capable of surviving passage around the northern tip of the peninsula that separated the bay from an open ocean. Across the bay, the mountains of the spine, saw-toothed, and ridge-backed, behind a bank of obscuring haze, and the salt water between appeared deep and cold and unfriendly. Gray clouds lay low upon the bay and land alike, and a muffled stillness softened the sound of Murtagh's steps. A cold touch on his hand caused him to look up. Thick flakes of snow drifted downward. The first snow of the year. He opened his mouth and caught a flake of his tongue. It melted like a pleasant memory, fleeting and substantial. Even this far north, it was unseasonably early for snow. Maddentide had only been 2 days past, and with that marked the first run of Bergenhead, the silvery, hard-scaled fish that invaded the bay every autumn. The shoals were so large and dense you could nearly walk on them, and Murtagh had heard that. During their height, the fish would throw themselves onto the decks of the boats, driven to insanity by the intensity of their spawning urge. There was a lesson in that, he felt. Snow didn't usually arrive until a month or two after Maddentide. For it to be this early meant a bitter, brutal winter was on the way. Still, Murtagh enjoyed the soft fall of flakes, and he had appreciated the coolness of the air. It was the perfect temperature for walking, running, or fighting. Few things were worse than struggling for your life while so hot as to pass out. His pulse quickened, and he tossed back his hood and broke into a quick trot, feeling the need to move faster. He kept a steady pace as he ran onto the flats surrounding Sunin, past creeks and copses, over the stone fence and through the fields of barley and rye ripe for harvest. No one marked his passage save a hound at a farmhouse gate, who gave him a perfunctory howl. And the same to you, Murtagh thought. His connection with Thorn thinned as he ran, but it never vanished, which was a comfort for Murtagh. He felt as nervous as Thorn. He felt as nervous as Thorn when they were apart, although he worked to hide the feeling, not wanting to worsen the dragon's concern. Murtagh would have preferred the land closer to Sunin. If he needed help, every second would count. However, the risk of someone spotting them, Thorn, was too great. Best to keep their distance and avoid a potential confrontation with local forces. Murtagh rolled his neck. Being on his feet, lungs full of clean, crisp air, pulse pounding at a quick, sustainable beat, felt good. After spending most of the day on Dragonback, his knees and hips ached slightly. He wasn't bow-legged like so many from the cavalry men of Galbatorix's army. Excuse me. But if he continued to spend most of his time on Thorn, it could yet happen. Was that an inevitable part of being a dragon rider? A crooked smile lifted his lips. The thought of far-famed riders, especially the elven ones, walking around with legs as bent as those as a 20-year veteran. Lancer was amusing, but he doubted that he had been the case. The riders likely had a way to counter the effect of being in the saddle, and at any state. Once a dragon was large enough, it became impossible to sit on like a horse. Shuriken, Galbatorix's mountainous black dragon, had been like that. Instead of a saddle, the king installed a small pavilion on the hump of Shuriken's enormous shoulders. Murtagh shivered and stopped by a lightning-struck tree. A sudden chill washed his arms and legs. He took a deep breath, and another. Galbatorix was dead. Shuriken was dead, and they had no hold on him or anyone still living. "We're free," he whispered. From Thorn came a sense of comforting warmth, like a distant embrace. He pulled his hood back over his head and continued on. A brief pause in the chapter. Oh, excuse me. When MURTAGH arrived at the coastal road of Sudan, he pushed behind a nearly hedgerow and poked his head over the top. To his relief, the road was empty. He pushed through the hedge and hurried north, toward the wide, slumped bulk of the city. The faint light that penetrated the clouds had nearly vanished, and he wanted to be in Sudan before the dark fell. Deep wagon tracks ridged the well-worn road, and paths of cow dung forced him to switch lanes every few steps. The snow was gathering on the ground in a soft, thin layer that reminded him of the decorative lace that ladies would wear to high events at court. He slowed as he approached Sudan's outer wall. The fortifications were stout and well-built, if not so high as those of Terim or Drasleona. Excuse me. The blocks of rude surfaced black stone were mortared without gaps, and the wall had a properly angled batter at the bottom, which he noted with approval. Not that any of it mattered if you were facing a dragon rider. Excuse me, a dragon or rider. I apologize. A pair of watchmen leaned on their pikes at either side of the Sudan's southern gate. MURTAGH glanced at the battlements and machicolations above. No archers were posted on the wall walk. Sloppy. The watchman straightened as he neared, and MURTAGH let his cloak fall open to show he was unarmed. A clink sounded as the watchmen crossed their pikes. "Who goes?" asked a man on the left. He had a face like winter rutabaga, with a fat nose, cobwebbed and burst blood vessels, and a yellow bruise under his right eye. "Just a madden-tide traveler," said MURTAGH in an easy tone. "Come to purchase smoked Bergen head for my master." The man on the right gave him a suspicious once-over. He looked as if he could be the cousin of Fat Nose. "Says you, where you hail from, traveller? And what name might you use?" "Tornak, son of Tereth, and I hail from Aurelia." Mention of the capital put some stiffness into the watchmen's backs. They glanced at each other, and then Fat Nose hacked and spat on the ground. The gob melted a patch of snow. "That's an awful long way on foot with no pack and no horse for a few bushels of fish." "It would be," MURTAGH agreed, "but my horse broke her leg last night. Stepped into a badger hole. Poor thing." "And you left your saddle?" said the right-hand man. MURTAGH shrugged. "My master pays well, but he's not paying me to lug a saddle and bags halfway across Allegatia. If you follow." The watchman smirked, and Fat Nose said, "Aye, we follow. Have you lodging secured? Coin for a bed?" "Coin enough." Fat Nose nodded. "Aye. We're not wanting strangers sleeping on our streets. We find you making use of 'em, we'll see the backside of you. We find you making trouble, out you go. From midnight to the 4th watch, the gates are closed, and they're not open for aught but Queen Nasuda herself." "That seems reasonable," said MURTAGH. Fat Nose grunted, and the watchmen moved their pikes aside. MURTAGH gave them a respectful nod and passed between them to enter the city. Another brief pause. And for those wondering, when I say a brief pause, I'm talking about this line right here in the chapter of the book, just in case you're wondering. MURTAGH scratched his chin as he moved deeper into Sudan. He had grown a beard at the beginning of the year to help conceal his identity. He thought it was working. So far, no one had accosted him. The beard was itchy, though, and he wasn't willing to let it get long enough that the hair become soft and pliable. Untidiness bothered him. Trimming the beard with his dagger had proved impractical, and he was reluctant to resort to magic, as shaping the beard with nothing more than a word and an imagined outcome was an uncertain prospect. Besides, he didn't trust a spell to remove the hairs, but not his skin, and there was a craftsman-like satisfaction in attending to the task by hand. He thought he'd bought a pair of iron clippers from a tinker outside of Narration. They worked well enough as long as he kept them sharp, oiled, and free of rust. Even so, he found maintaining the beard almost as much trouble as shaving. Quick pause, amen to that one. Back to the story. Maybe he should remove it after leaving Sunyan. The main street was a muddy strip, twice the width of the southern road. The buildings were half-timbered, crook-framed structures with lap strakes striding between the wooden beams. The beams themselves were stained black with pine tar, which protected them against salt from the bay, and many were decorated with carvings of sea serpents, birds, and svartlings. Iron weather vanes sat idle atop every hinge, steep-sided roof, and a carved dragon head decorated to peak at the most of houses. MURTAGH forced himself to stop scratching. He could have recited the whole history from the city from its founding until the present. He knew that the carvings were in style commonly called kisk, which had been invented by some anonymous craftsperson over a century past. That the black stone in the outer walls came from a quarry not 24 miles northeast, and that the good folk of Sunyan had a deathly fear of the Elves forest, Duvelvarden, and went to great lengths to keep the ranks of dark-needled pine trees from encroaching on their fields. All that and more he knew. But to what end? He'd received the finest education in the land, and then some, and yet his life was now one of the rough of travel, where sharpness of hearing and quickness of hand meant more than any scholarly learning. Besides, understanding what was and what one should do were two very different things. He had seen what Galbatorix, the king, had known more than most, more than even then some of the oldest elves or dragons. But in the end, his knowledge had brought it with no wisdom. Few people were out on the streets. It was late, and the days following the Maddentide were full of feasting, and the most of the citizens were inside, celebrating another successful harvest of Bergenhead. A trio of laborers staggered past, stinking of cheap beer and fish guts. MURTAGH held his course, and they diverted around him. Once they turned a corner, the main thoroughfare again fell silent, and he didn't see another person until he crossed the city's market square, and a pair of feathered merchants burst out of a warehouse door, arguing vociferously. A short, bearded figure followed them into the square, and his voice bellowed loudest of all. "A dwarf!" MURTAGH ducked his head. Ever since the death of Galbatorix and the fall of the Empire over a year ago, dwarves had become increasingly common throughout human settled lands. Most were traders selling stones and metals and weapons, but he'd also seen dwarves working as armed guards. Short as they were, their prowess in battle was not to be underestimated. MURTAGH could not help but wonder how many of them were acting as eyes and ears for their king, Auric, who sat upon the marble throne in the city mountain of Trojanheim. In the backlit dwarf, seemed to look his way, and MURTAGH reeled slightly. Another Maddentide drunk on his way home. The ruse worked, and the dwarf returned attention to the squabbling merchants. MURTAGH hurried on. The spread of dwarves had made travel even more difficult for him and Thorn. MURTAGH had nothing against the dwarves as a race or a culture. Indeed, he quite liked Auric, and their feats of architecture were astonishing. However, they held a deep and abiding hatred for him for killing King Hrothgar, Auric's predecessor and uncle. The dwarves were known for the tenacity of which they could held their grudges. Could he ever make amends to Auric, his clan, and the dwarves as a whole? Were it possible, MURTAGH had yet to think of the means. Unfortunately, the situation with the dwarves wasn't unique. The elves maintained a similar animosity toward him and Thorn, on account of the role they had played in killing Oromnus and Gladir, the last surviving rider and dragon from before Galbatorix's rise to power. MURTAGH could hardly blame them. The average human was no fonder to them, as it was widely believed that they had betrayed the Varden to Galbatorix during the war. Traitors earned only contempt from both sides in conflict, and rightly so. MURTAGH himself had no sympathy for snake-tongued oath-breakers like his father, but that did not make it easy to be falsely branded as one. No safe harbor for us, thought MURTAGH. A hard, humorless smile formed on his lips. So it had been his whole life. Why should it be any different now? The stench of fish, seaweed, and salt grew stronger as he moved along the wharves and past rows of drying racks set beside the street. He glanced up. Midnight was still 3 or 4 hours away. Plenty of time to conclude his business and depart soon. After so long spent out of doors, in the wild reaches of the land, the closeness of the buildings felt uncomfortably constraining, and in that, he was becoming more and more like Thorn. Music and voices sounded ahead of him until he saw the common house that was his destination, the fulsome feast. The low, dark-beamed building had crystal windows set in front of its facing wall, a rare luxury in this part of the world, and petals of yellow light spread across the paving stones of the street, a welcome invitation to enter, rest, and make merry. Saros had picked the place as the location of their next meeting, and that alone made MURTAGH wary. Still, the fulsome feast seemed innocuous enough. Just one more disheveled, hard-run establishment, like so many others. Aside from the crystal windows, the common house could have been in any seaside town or village throughout the land, but then MURTAGH had learned long ago that appearances were rarely to be trusted. He steeled himself against the noise to follow and pushed open the door. And that is the end of Chapter 1. Quite extensive. Well, thank you all so much for watching, listening, having a good laugh if I made my whistling S's go too much or too hard. Constructive criticism is always welcome. And remember to love yourself and love one another. And until the next time, later days.